We'll say, hey, with Resonate guys, we are here and we are in this Third Way series. And as we get into this, really what we're talking about is this polarization that has just dominated this landscape of our world right now. And so you kind of have these two ways to think, right? You think this way or that way. You think red or blue, conservative or progressive, Republican, Democrat. And there's kind of this all-in kind of ethic that you have to have this full package, one way or the other way. And what happens is that as we begin to talk about this, it seems like we drift on one side or the other side. And ultimately, as we talk about where Jesus fits into this, if we just simply begin to pick one side or the other and say, this is what Jesus thinks about this, ultimately what happens is we become salespeople. And we begin to try to motivate people to change what they believe and to believe on the other side. And as we look at our politics, as we look at kind of just the entire way that works in our social constructs, people don't change their minds like that. And so we get like these dogmatic realities and we get stuck. But the good news is that when we look at actually what Jesus intended the church to do, it is really doesn't fit into any of those categories. In fact, what he says is this. He gives a metaphor that people who follow after him, that Christ followers, Christians, people who have the gospel as the worldview for them, they're to be two things. They're to be salt and light. And as we talked about this, the idea of salt is this, that it flavorizes and it preserves, that it brings something to the culture. It brings something to what it's inserted into. And you begin to see the metaphor of light that begins to strip away darkness and to expose things. And this is what we are to be as people who are followers of Jesus. And this is really good news because you have something to say. That if you're a follower of Jesus here, as we look in the Word and say, what does that mean? You have something to say. You have something to add to this. And it's not just the back and forth bickering of trying to motivate people to change their minds in something. And so in this, what we begin to see is that Jesus isn't just one thing or it's the other, but it's something that is altogether different. And here's why this is key. What he says about being salty, what he says about us being salt to the world around us, he says this, if the salt loses its saltiness, it's no good. It's only good to be thrown out. Now, here's what this means for us. Is that if we don't understand that we have content, that there's something that we have to say, that Jesus has to say to the world that is fundamentally different. And if we understand what that is, we have a voice. We have something to bring to this. We have something to add to the conversation. And today you need to know what that is. And you need to know where it is that oftentimes you fall into binary choices and you say it's either this or that, but there's a beautiful third way. And to get into this, as we talk about this, we're going to be talking about a topic that may seem strange to talk about. It may seem like this doesn't fit as we've been talking about these different issues. But what I want today to talk about is your relationship with material things, your relationship with your money, your relationship with your resources, your relationship with the things that you own, with your material possessions. And the fascinating thing about this, there's two things that I know. And the first is this, that your relationship to your stuff, that it is something that you don't know that you have an issue with. One of the realities is that no one believes they have an issue with stuff. No one believes that they have an issue with their money. And it's just a fascinating thing that we are radically blinded to this. That we are radically blinded to the idea that our relationship with our stuff and our relationship to our money might be dysfunctional. It might be something that is ultimately causing us grief and not satisfaction. And the thing is, as I've talked to hundreds of people, I've had 18 years of experience, no one believes, hey, you know what my biggest issue is? I'm greedy. No one says that, you know. You know what I think that my thing is, that I'm not having the kind of satisfaction I want out of life? It's because I'm materialistic. No one says that. No one has ever said that to me. And I think it's because we have these significant blinders. Now, the interesting thing is we know what those things look like. In fact, we can spot them in other people, and we can begin to think about, let me read you a few statements and see if there's someone who pops up that fits into these statements. Greedy people talk and worry a lot about money. Greedy people are not cheerful givers. Greedy people are reluctant to share. Greedy people are poor losers. Greedy people quibble over insignificant sums of money. Greedy people talk as if they just have enough to get by. Greedy people won't let you forget what they've done for you. Greedy people aren't content with what they have. Greedy people are reluctant to express gratitude. Greedy people attempt to control people with their money. Now, it might be that as I read through those, and I know I went really quick through that there might be someone you're like, oh yeah, they totally do that. They absolutely do that. And what's so difficult about this is that our relationship with our stuff and our relationship with our money is so ingrained to our identity that we can't figure out sometimes when we have an issue with this. I remember not believing that I had an issue with this as well, just like everyone else, until I had this moment, and I began to recognize some stuff. A few years ago, let me back up. I love playing the acoustic guitar. I've done it for years. I own 4 of them. I own 4 acoustic guitars. You can only play one at a time. However, I have 4 of them. And so there was a worship leader who needed to borrow an acoustic guitar. He didn't have one. He needed to borrow one. He knew that I had one, and so I have 4 of them, and they are in a range of quality from not very good to the very best I have, right? And so he found out, he asked me, hey, Keith, can I borrow an acoustic guitar to lead worship? And I said, yes, absolutely. And I handed him the guitar that was not my best guitar. And so I thought, this is the guitar that I'm happy to let you own, or happy to let you borrow. And that was that first moment of being able to say, I don't want to give you my best thing, right? I want to be a good steward for the thing that's the best. And I want you to know that I have an acoustic guitar that I absolutely love. I saved up, I found the guitar that I wanted to, and then I wanted to know so much about it that I drove to Vancouver, BC, to the place where they built the guitar. And I met the people that built my guitar, and I met the people that assembled it, and I saw the entire thing. I love this thing, right? It's really great. And so when I said, yeah, you can have this guitar, he said, well, can I have that guitar? Can I use that guitar? And he's speaking about the one that was my really nice guitar. And I, of course, said, no, you can't. And then I immediately recognized that was not what a believer should do. And so I was like, no, here, take this. You can use it. And he used the guitar that was my nice guitar. Well, he was done with it. He brought it back, and I remember after he left, opening it up, and there, across the front of it, were all of these pick marks. All of these, where you strum the guitar, there was all of these lines that the pick, because he had been somewhat aggressive with my guitar, and there was all these things, and I was just internally, I was like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? And at that moment, I began to recognize I'm greedy. I'm just flat greedy. I wanted to give you the not very good one, and then I decided to give you the one that is better, and then when you used it, I was frustrated that you used it. And it was that moment that I began to recognize, oh my goodness, I have an issue. I can disguise it as being like, I'm just gonna be careful with it, but really it's greed. And you'd think I would have learned, but a couple of years ago, my son began to play the trumpet. Well, I played the trumpet back in high school, and I had a trumpet that was sitting around our house, and so brought it back, and so we had this trumpet that was there, and I remember there was a moment that I was going to give this to my son to be able to, here, you can play this now, but then I had a moment where I began to recognize that this is an 11-year-old kid. And this is a Bach Stradivarius Silver Model 37, trumpet, and I began to think, nah, I'm not going to give it to you. We'll buy one. We'll buy a really cheap one. And it was like, again, there was that moment where I began to recognize that my stuff and like this veneer of protection was really just, I don't want you to mess up my stuff. And here's what I want you to get. That oftentimes, when it comes to greed, when it comes to this stuff, what we begin to see is this, that it doesn't have any kind of connection to any socioeconomic boundaries. It doesn't have any connection to whether they're rich people or poor people, that there's something that happens that we are blind to. But here's the other thing. Jesus teaches, this is, if the number one thing is we can't see it or we're blind to it, the number two thing is this, that Jesus taught that the chief competitor for your heart and your devotion is your stuff and your money. That more than anything, Jesus taught this, that your stuff and your money is the thing that is going to leverage your heart away from him more than anything else. And that can kind of seem mind-blowing to us, that he's not talking about other gods, he's not talking about other people, he's not talking about opportunities, he's not talking about sin. He's saying this, that your stuff and your money is the thing that leverages your heart and your devotion away from Jesus more than anything else. Here's what he says in Luke 12:15. It says this, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Life doesn't consist of an abundance of possessions. He says, watch out, that you might not be able to see it coming, but you need to understand that your life does not consist of the abundance of your possession. So here's what you need to know, that who you are is deeply woven into your stuff, your material things, and your finances. It is. And in that, oftentimes you can't tell how significantly it's tied up into those things. And so when it comes to this, and when we begin to see this play itself out, this reality is we need to be able to expose this, and we need to be able to look at it and to be able to see how this operates. Because what you're going to see is this, that there's two ways that our world begins to approach money. And there's two ways that we begin to see money, and both of those ways are broken, but Jesus has a third way. And that third way is going to help you to understand really how you live your life and how you interact with money. And that's going to be a significant thing. Many of you here are in this early stages of your earning potential. And as you begin to develop and as you begin to graduate college, as you go on into careers, there's going to be an incredible potential for you to derail your life or to do something that is really significant with it. And it's going to be centered around what you do with your finances and material things. And so I want you to get this thing. So let's outline these two ways that we mess up money and material things. The first one is this. The first way that we see the whole thing really messed up is the idea of greed, or the reality of greed. And here's what greed is. Greed is when we use our money for ourselves, and we are driven for the accumulation of wealth. And here's why. Because it either gives us security or pleasures. And it's basically one of those two things that when we begin to think, I'm going to accumulate wealth, and it's going to be for my benefit and for my pleasure, for my satisfaction, we do it in one of two ways. We do it in this way of either beginning to collect this and being able to have this in order to have security. And so this idea of we hoard things so that we have security in it. And this is this reality. If I have enough money, then that will protect me from anything that might go wrong in the world. And I can be protected from something that goes wrong if I just have enough money to create a pad. So that is that hoarding mentality. There's others of us that have this issue with being able to think about money through the lens of it provides me with things that I want, and I take pleasure in those things, right? So I can use money to get things that I like, and so I spend it. So you can hoard it or spend it, but the root of each of those things is this heart that is greedy. And here's what's difficult is oftentimes we can't see it. Oftentimes we don't think we're greedy because we look at our thing and we think that's just normal, and we look at someone else's and we're really good at discerning, oh, that's super greedy. Why would you do something like that? And it's really just because we don't have those same choices. Now, I'll take my wife and I, for example. My wife loves experiences. She is an experienced girl. She's take the picture, make the memory, and I'm a I want to have it and touch it and look at it kind of guy. And so when we begin to think about greed and we begin to have issues, I look at like, why do we want to have that extravagant of a vacation or an experience? And why would you spend money on that? And she says, why would you spend money on that thing? It's just going to collect in the garage, right? And so there's those two things. And I look at her and say, man, that's super greedy. And she looks at me and says, that's super greedy. But each of those things have the root in the same thing. They're just different. And so in this, we begin to see what Jesus says to this, or really this is what Paul says to Timothy. And he says, this is how we need to be able to understand greed. It says this in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9. It says this, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Man, that is like hardcore. He is going right at it. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. It says this in verse 10, for the love of money is the roots of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many grief. It says this, that there is a trap, there is a temptation, there is a reality that is waiting for us. And that reality for us to be able to say, hey, I want to be rich. I want to have wealth. I want to accumulate this. I want to be someone who has this amount of money. And I want to be able to do that so that I could have this kind of life. And ultimately, what Paul is saying to his disciple Timothy, he's like, you've got to help the church understand that this is the pathway to destruction, to ruin. And this is the pathway to many, many grief. That we begin to see this and we can see how this greed gets fed. And now, when we begin to think about this more broadly and we begin to think about this way, what we begin to see is the system of capitalism. And the system of capitalism is one that feeds the greed. And it feeds the greed for us to be able to say, you can do it, you can build it up, you can make your own empire. And I don't know if you've ever seen this show, American Greed. Really, it's a fascinating thing because it really starts with a guy who has an idea, right? A way to cheat the system. And then the entire show basically shows the unraveling of this person as they begin to take this idea to get ahead, and it begins to morph into this entire scheme that ultimately takes them down, right? And it ultimately creates something that they are in jail for or worse. And so this is this reality, American greed, and we begin to see this play itself out. And so we begin to see this, and we see Jesus critiquing this. And we're beginning to say, hey, this is what this is. This is something that when we look at this, just to be able to say, hey, you can make this life, right? You can make this life for yourself, that has deep pitfalls to it. And so we can't go there. So what's the other side? What's the other way? And the other way that we think about this is oftentimes something that we don't think about a lot. But I think it's helpful for us because it's another way that oftentimes we think about money that's equally unhelpful. So if we have greed on one side, the second way is this, it's guilt. And here's what I mean by guilt. Guilt is this idea that you shouldn't have anything of significance materially. That if you have something nice, it's a reflection of misplaced priorities. That because maybe you have more than someone else, that you should feel ashamed of yourself because of an inequity. That if you have more than someone else, that level of inequity is something that you should have inherent guilt about, and you should do something about this thing. And any kind of disproportionate wealth structure is inherently bad. Now, this is the other thing. So you have greed and you have guilt on this other side. And we might not see as much of that, but it exists. And it exists in places where we begin to see, hey, you shouldn't own that, or you should that's extravagant, or you shouldn't be able to possess that, or you shouldn't be able to enjoy that if you have that. Now, oftentimes that's seen as the antithesis of greed, and we see that as like piety. But I want you to get that that's equally broken as a way of thinking. And if we just say, hey, you know what? The other side of greed, hey, for us to combat the massive reality of greed, we need to be able to insert guilt. And that is fundamentally not what Jesus came to do. Now, here's a moment, and I'm not going to go into the scripture, but I'm going to tell you the story, and you can find it in scripture to be able to make sure that I'm telling you the right thing. There's a moment where this woman named Mary comes to not Joseph, wrong story, different Mary. This Mary comes to Jesus, and she has this incredibly expensive perfume. And it's incredibly expensive. It says that it's worth a year's wages. So whether that's 2,000 years ago or in this year, what you begin to see is equally something of significant value. It probably was the most significant thing she owned. And she takes this and she breaks and she spills and she basically takes that perfume and she puts it across Jesus' feet, basically to anoint him, to be able to say, hey, this is how significant you are. This is how important you are. This is the extravagant measure that I can show you how you, just how significant you are in this. And what happens is around Jesus, there is a murmuring. And the murmuring goes something like this. You see Judas say, why did you do that? You could have taken that and sold it and given the money to the poor. And so what you begin to see there is you see that inherent guilt, that idea that this thing that was this material thing that was given to Jesus, that Jesus shouldn't have experienced this, he shouldn't have received that, but instead it should have been used for the poor. Now, you see Jesus teach extensively about the poor and extensively about providing for the poor. But I want you to get that what Jesus does is he allows this material, he receives this material thing. Now, if you begin to think about Jesus' mission, this is something that's right in line with this, right? That she sees Jesus as what he really is the Messiah, the Son of God. And it's such a big deal that she takes the most significant material thing and she gives that. And what he does is he receives that. And so I want you to get that the material thing, that to receive the material thing in and of itself is not something that Jesus teaches is to be leveraged towards guilt or is to bring out guilt. Jesus takes and he receives that. And then he rebukes Judas for having this guilt mentality towards himself and this woman named Mary. Now, I want you to get to the beginning of the early church. It was 120 people, but it began to spread. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And it began to really begin to get into every part of society. And it wasn't just those people who believed that being poor was the only way to be a believer. It wasn't just people who thought, oh, in order for you to be a follower of Jesus, you have to be poor. What we begin to see as we study church history is that it is in all walks of life. And when they get into places in cities, you begin to see people with power, people with significant wealth. And this is a part of what it looks like for the kingdom of God to be built up, because these are followers that have wealth and that have power. And ultimately, they also are in alignment with who God is. And so you have greed and you have guilt. So what is the third way? If it's not greed saying, hey, I'm going to use money to replace what Jesus is meant to give to me, that I'm ultimately supposed to be satisfied by Jesus, but I'm ultimately going to replace Jesus with my material things and my finances. And it's also not that I should believe that material things are inherently evil. Then what's the third way? What do we have? What is the message that we, if you're a believer here, have to say to the world around us in regards to one of the most significant things, and that is how you deal with your finances and your material things? What is the good news? What is the good news of the gospel? And here it is. The third way is it is neither greed nor guilt, but it is a generosity. That generosity is the way of Jesus. Now, I want you to get that from the very beginning, that this generosity marked people. And here's what I want to do. You're going to get your entire life, you're going to get people that guilt you to give, that inspire you to give, that ask you to give, motivate you to give. But I want you to learn how to be generous. And I want you to be generous people, because I want you to get that you're sitting here in this room and you're here because a group of people didn't just have a worldview that included heaven and hell, didn't have a worldview that included a Messiah named Jesus, but they had a behavior of radical generosity. And I want you to get this, that in that context, when they began to talk about this Jesus, it was a bizarre and radical message. And in a bizarre and radical message, what you begin to see is the massive expansion of the church. In the first 40 years, it grew by 40% every decade. I mean, this is a massive movement. We begin to see this thing encircle the globe. And how did it begin? How did this wild message of this Messiah named Jesus begin to take hold in such a bizarre and radical way? And I want to tell you that's this, is that people looked at the lives of those who were followers of Jesus, and what they saw, they might not have understood the Christianity piece. They might not have understood the gospel piece. They might not have understood Jesus. But what they saw with their eyes was radical generosity. And they saw a community of people that were radically generous with each other. And that community of people that began to display radical generosity, that began to validate the belief system in a significant way. People lean in. I promise you, we all lean in. When there's a moment of radical generosity, we want to know why. Because it doesn't make any sense. Because we begin to see what's normal in our culture. And what we see is radical generosity is way outside of normal. It is way outside. So they struggled with the message of Jesus. It was crazy, but there was something about these people that was unmistakable, something that was different, something that ultimately was incredibly attractive. And they gave not just their money, but they gave their time and they gave their space. And the believability of the gospel was wrapped in generosity. The believability of the gospel was wrapped in generosity. And so the legacy of expanding the gospel is this. Paul tells the next leader, he tells Timothy, you've got to make sure that the church never loses its radical generosity. And so here's what he writes in chapter 6 of 1 Timothy, verse 17. He says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Okay, what Jesus just did there is he took and he exposed both sides of the pitfall, right? The greed thing. So do not be arrogant. Don't put your hope in wealth. Put your hope in God. And so don't say, I need to get more stuff in order to be able to find my hope in things, but find your hope in God, right? But he also says this, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment, meaning the things in our life for our enjoyment, meaning that it is okay to find joy in the material things that God has provided for us, that shouldn't invoke guilt to us, that should be able to invoke contentment and appreciation for those things. That we shouldn't think, I shouldn't have these things, but we should think, this is given to me to enjoy. So it's neither greed nor guilt. And here's what he says. So here's what are we to do? Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasures for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. This is really key. You want to know how to be rich. Jesus tells you this is how to be rich. Be rich in good deeds and generous and willing to share. This is how you become rich. Or this is how you become a good rich person, that you begin to be someone who is more oriented to being rich in good deeds, being generous and willing to share. And so I want to give you a few things, just how do we do this? How is it that you begin to leverage this in your life? And so let me give you 3 P's that might help you to be able to understand just a beginning spot for generosity in your giving. It is priority, percentage, and progressive. Priority, percentage, and progressive. I want you to say that with me. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Priority, percentage, and progressive. Basically, if you think about these 3 P's, and you're going to forget most of what is said, but I want you to think about how you begin to build a generous spirit. First of all, you think about priority. And what you think is when you get funds, whether that is in a regular way, in a paycheck, or if you are in a context where you don't get a paycheck, you have an amount of money that you have control over. And when you have that, what you think is this: how is it that I give to God first? How is it that I give to God first? And I want you to understand that when you put the prioritization of giving to God first, it radically changes the position of your heart. Now, oftentimes, here's what we do. We begin to think this. We get an amount of money and we consume, and then what's left over we save, and then what's left over we give. And that's the typical way we live. We consume, and then if we have ever anything left over, we save, and then we give if there's anything left from that. And ultimately, what that does is it just creates this massive greed monster in our hearts. And here's what I would say. This is what Jesus says, is to prioritize, to give first to God. To be able to say, the first thing that I'm going to do is to recognize the lordship and the supreme nature of who God is, and that he has given everything, so I give back to God. So I'm going to give to God, and then I'm going to use the rest for me. I'm going to give to God first. And so being able to prioritize that. The next thing is to be able to give a percentage. And as you give a percentage, what this does is it allows whatever context for you to have a constant in terms of that level of sacrifice that you give and that level of generosity that you give. So when you begin to give, think about what percentage, and to be able to think through that. And as you begin to grow in your earning potential, what you're going to be able to see is that you're going to be able to give more and more and more because you have a percentage that stays constant. And you don't think, hey, this is what I've given for years and years, and now I've doubled my salary, but I'm still staying at this same kind of thing. And ultimately what that does is, again, it shifts that priority. And so if you give a percentage gift, it allows you to be able to operate with immense amount of freedom in that. The last thing is progressive. And here's what I mean by this, that when we continue to press ourselves towards generosity, it allows us to continue to eject greed from our heart. And so if you think about maturing in Christ, as you're getting more and more mature as you follow Jesus, shouldn't that affect your generosity? Shouldn't that affect your level of giving? That if you begin to think about what it is for you to say, okay, this is where I was in this season of life, and I'm going to have a greater amount of generosity as I learn more about who Jesus is, and as I begin to discover more about Jesus, it's going to now enable me to have a greater amount of generosity in my life. So priority, percentage, and progressive. But that might be difficult, and you might say, hey, that's going to be a hard thing. So how is it that you orient your life? And so I want to give you 2 ideas about really how is it that you begin to be that kind of giver. One is this: generous people see themselves as managers, not owners. Generous people see themselves as managers, not owners. And here's why. When you begin to understand really the context of your wealth, and you begin to understand where you're at and how you connect to a holy God, one of the things that you have to understand is this, is that everything that has been given to you, that everything has been given to you. And you might say, hey, I worked for this, or I earned this. But then if you begin just to think about that just a little bit, you begin to recognize who gave you the gifts that you leverage, who gave you the capacity, who gave you this reality and this context for you to be able to earn money. It was God. You didn't deserve that. You've been given that capacity. So I want you to get this, that it's all God's. And as we begin to think about this, that God has given this to us to manage, but not be an owner, that this one little statement, guys, could shift everything in your heart in terms of contentment. Because haven't you ever been in a context where you've been given money, right? Where you've been given money to accomplish something, and there's a radical difference, isn't there, between someone else's money that you get to spend and your money that you get to spend. And you're like, man, there's nothing that is significant in terms of being able to have anxiety when it's someone else's money and you just have to spend someone else's money, right? It radically changes it. So when you begin to think, hey, this is all God's stuff, and I can be a manager, but I'm not an owner. The moment that we think I'm an owner or I'm a consumer, what happens is our contentment level just drops. What I want you to get is I want you to experience the joy of being content. And that comes from you being able to see all of your stuff and you disrespecting the money, you disrespecting your stuff in order for it to be able to be something that is managed by you, but not necessarily you see it as being owned by you. This will radically change. Now, you should take care of your stuff, right? Be a good steward of it. But for you to be able to say, I'm just a manager of this and not an owner is the pathway to freedom. The next thing is generous people see their resources as tools for God's kingdom, not to grow their own kingdom. Let's go back to this. It says this in verse 19. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Here's what generous people begin to see the things that they've been given as tools for something greater. As they begin to think that generous people make eternal investments, not just earthly investments. As they see their stuff as something to be leveraged towards the kingdom of God, they begin to make a difference in this world by thinking of the next world. This is what C.S. Lewis says, hey, the people who've made the greatest change in this world are people who think mainly about the next. And they begin to leverage the things they have in this world to make a bigger impact in the next. And ultimately what happens is they make significant impacts in this world. And what it means is that we have to trust in our Heavenly Father, that we have to trust that He would provide. And if we're going to be generous, we have to trust that He is going to be there. And so this is a phrase that I've used before, that I want you just to ingrain this, that I will not trust in riches, but in Him who richly provides. I will not trust in riches, but in Him who richly provides. This is a statement that I've seen play out as I've been interacting over the last couple of years with people who want to invest in Resonate Church. Part of my job as lead pastor is to ultimately resource this movement called Resonate. And to do that, what I've been able to do is sit down in coffee shops, in homes, in boardrooms, and I've sat across from men and women who understand this third way, understand this generosity. And many of them have made significant amount of money, and they've been able to figure out how to understand the context of God and their money in a way that allows them to say, I want to make a kingdom investment. And praise the Lord that they have found out about Resonate Church and have wanted to make kingdom investments into Resonate Church. But as I interact with these people, it's so amazing because what they do is they begin to tell about their journey to generosity, and some of it's radical generosity. I mean, people who have made millions of dollars and set their standards of living significantly below that, and ultimately said, hey, I don't want to ultimately just expand my capacity to be able to consume, but I want to expand my capacity to give. And so I wrote down a few things that I've heard because, man, when someone talks about the radical generosity, you just want to say, hey, tell me about that. I want to know how that begins to make sense in your heart. And here's a few things that I've heard people say. I set a percentage and I decided never to go below this. In fact, I started increasing my percentage and it became a personal challenge to grow the amount that I gave away. Isn't that an incredible thing? A guy's telling me that I started with 1x and now I'm at 2x. If this is the amount I'm giving away, now I'm at 2x, 2 times that amount giving away. And here's another statement. I knew that as I made more money, my standard of living would be raised and my expectations would rise. So I set my standard of living and decided that I would grow my standard of giving instead of just my standard of living. What a crazy statement, right? That just doesn't make any sense to our culture, that someone would say, "How I want to grow my standard of giving." But it's generosity. It's people who understand what Jesus has done. Another one said, "I enjoy really nice things, so I make sure that I give God back what he gave me first." This is significant. A guy named Adam Grant wrote a book called Give and Take, and it's a business book. But in this business book, basically he said in all organizations, in all social realities, there's three different kinds of people. There are givers, people who are primarily oriented to giving to the people around them. There are takers. These are people who are primarily oriented to try to figure out how to get things from people around them. And there are matchers. And these people are people who basically go with whatever it is dominant in the context that they enter into. And what he says is this, it's really interesting. He said 70% of people are matchers. 70% of people begin to take, and the majority of people begin to orient their behavior when there's a model behavior given to them. And I want you to get this, guys, that when we talk about radical generosity, none of us are going to be able to do this on our own because it's so countercultural. But the good news is this, is that 2,000 years ago, God sent his son, his one and only son, Jesus, from heaven to earth. And he came to earth and he lived a perfect, sinless life. And then he did the most generous act in history. He gave his life for you. And he allowed himself, he orchestrated his death on a Roman cross to sacrifice his life so that through his sacrifice, you might have access to your heavenly Father, and you might have access to the kingdom of God, and you might have access to this relationship with God. And here's this reality, that action of incredible generosity is what we begin to operate out of. And so if the majority of us are matchers, what we have to do is to either look at the world around us and say, am I going to match the culture around me, a culture of greed or guilt, or am I going to match the culture that Jesus has set with one of radical generosity? You see, the early Christians, the people who started this whole movement called Christianity, they were generous because they looked at the cross and said, how can we hoard? How can we have guilt? How can we basically take all this stuff for ourselves when we have a Savior that's been radically generous? And they began to simply display that generosity to the people around them, and it changed the world. But it's because of Jesus, and we look to Jesus, and we match Jesus, and we begin to say, this is the model for us, that we give generously because we have been given generously too. And it changes people. There's a church that's a good friend of ours, and I remember talking to some people in this church, and they talked about being on campus and interacting for the first couple of weeks of school with this young lady who was a freshman. And as they interacted with her, they found out that suddenly, about the third or fourth week of school, that her mom died. And she lived in a different part of the country. And this group of 3 or 4 of these girls that were beginning to get to know this freshman, they decided, she didn't know how she was going to get back. She didn't have a whole lot of money. They decided that they were going to pay for her plane ticket to go back to see her mom. But not just that. They knew that that was a massive thing. And they knew that she needed support. So even though they just knew her for just a little bit of time, those 4 girls decided that they would all take and they would go fly with her so that she would have someone to be able to go with. And they tell the story, and I'm hearing this young lady talk about how it radically changed her life. And all of a sudden, Jesus became very relevant. Jesus began to be interesting because all of these people were displaying the kind of life that was radically different than anything she'd ever experienced before. And now that young lady decided that she was going to make Jesus her Lord and Savior. And ultimately, she's leveraging her life to live on mission, to be able to display the kind of generosity that captured her heart from the very beginning, because a group of people basically said, we see in Jesus a radical generosity, and that's what we want to display to the world. Now, I want you to get, that's what we want from Resonate Church. This year we put $10,000 into this thing called Kingdom Initiatives to basically say, hey, how can we be salt and light on this campus and in this community? And $10,000 is not a lot, but we want to be able to see this spark incredible generosity. In fact, over the next couple of years, I want to see that go from 10,000 to 100,000. And 10 years from now, what I want to be able to see is $1 million to be able to get brought into the context that we have our churches in, to be able to show radical generosity, because this is the way of Jesus. How can you participate in the way of Jesus? Neither greed nor guilt. But how is it that you have something to say? How are you salt and light? Because if you're a follower of Jesus, you've been called to be radically generous. This is what I pray for us, that we find contentment in this radical generosity.